History as it happens, June 10th, 2021. Third party folly.
We're not starting new parties. You know, they kept saying, he's going to start a brand new party. We have the Republican Party. It's going to unite and be stronger than ever before. I am not starting a new party.
Richard Hofstadter said third parties are like bees. Once they've stung, they die. He meant third parties don't win elections. They exist to goad the main parties into adopting their positions. And they can also act as spoilers in presidential contests. And now more than 100 prominent Republicans say they may form a third party to save the GOP from Trump. An effort doomed to fail? That's next, as we report History as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
I was not put on the ballot by either of the two parties. I was not put on the ballot by any PAC money, by any foreign lobbyist money, by any special interest money. This is a movement that came from the people.
Mr. Nixon and Mr. Humphrey both, in recorded statements, said, "It is a great movement. It is a great lie-in. It is a great demonstration. It is a great sit-in."
Millions of independent-minded voters will invest their conscience, their hopes, their dreams, their interests, and the interests of their descendants in making the Green Party a party of, by, and for the people so that it can move to make our government.
When you think of third parties, who comes to mind? My mind goes back to 1992.
We've got to clean this mess up, leave this country in good shape, and pass on the American dream to them. We've got to collect the taxes to do it. If there's a fairer way, I'm all ears.
The self-effacing Texas billionaire Ross Perot won 19% of the popular vote in 1992. That was the best showing for a third-party candidate in 80 years. I remember those debates, Perot on stage with President Bush and Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton.
Let me make it very clear. If people don't have the stomach to fix these problems, I think it's a good time to face it in November. If they do, then they will have heard the harsh reality of what we have to do. I'm not playing Lawrence Welk music tonight.
Perot was quite a personality, but was he the leader of a party? I mean, what party did he represent? The same might be asked of Ralph Nader in 2000. It's not that the Green Party doesn't exist, but how many Green Party officials actually hold elected office in the United States? None at the federal level. And according to the Green Party's website, it has about 150 office holders in the entire country at all levels of government, from school boards to city councils and state legislatures. So it's presidential level politics where third-party candidates come and go. But some do leave a mark, such as George Wallace in 1968.
I say that those who led us into it ought not to lead us out of it, because had they not given lip service to this anarchy in the streets 8 years ago, it would be safe to walk on the streets of Oklahoma City and of Tulsa and of Los Angeles and of Birmingham and the other large cities of our country.
Wallace carried 5 states. In 1948, Dixiecrat Strom Thurmond carried 4 states. Perot didn't win any. Of course, the parties and our politics had changed a good deal by the 1990s. But more important in all this is our election system. It simply does not make it feasible for third parties to take hold, especially at the national level. We have winner-take-all elections. Voting for an independent candidate may be principled, but on a practical level, well, here's Donald Trump at CPAC.
Wouldn't that be brilliant? Let's start a new party and let's divide our vote so that you can never win. No, we're not interested in that.
Now into this landscape come 100 prominent Republicans who say they may form a third party unless the GOP steers away from Trumpism. So what do you think? Can anti-Trump Republicans win primaries? Or is an overhaul of the way we elect our leaders really what we need?
I think we would be much better served as a nation with having a form of proportional representation where every vote matters equally, because you don't have to live in a swing district for your vote to be consequential.
And that is Lee Drutman, a senior fellow at New America and the author of Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop. We'll hear his prescription for fixing our politics in a moment, but first we're going to check in with the political scientist Norm Ornstein, an emeritus scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and co-author of One Nation After Trump, a guide for the perplexed, the disillusioned, the desperate, and the not yet deported. That is quite a book title. Norm Ornstein, welcome.
Great to be with you, Martin.
So before we dive into this issue of third parties and whether Republicans can form an anti-Trump splinter party, just want our listeners to know where you're coming from. You're an emeritus scholar at AEI. AEI known as a conservative think tank, but what are your politics, if you don't mind sharing?
So I am now emeritus, but I've been at AEI really since 1978. First part-time while I was teaching at Catholic University, and then full-time in the early 80s. I'm long called myself a raging moderate. I am certainly not in the mainstream of the other scholars at AEI. I am an outlier, I guess I would say. But I've been there for all of those years because I had just a complete level of academic freedom. I could say and do what I wanted, and even if it gave heartburn to many of my colleagues and to some of the members of our board.
And you were a critic of Donald Trump, correct?
Yes. And early on, I saw the way the Republican Party was going. And, a number of people, including some of our top political scientists, were writing in 2014 and 2015 that the Republican Party would do as they always do. They might flirt with an outsider, as they had, for example, with Herman Cain. But they go back and pick the establishment figure, the heir apparent, who back then, of course, was Jeb Bush. And I wrote a piece in The Atlantic in the summer of 2015 about why this was going to be different and why a Donald Trump type figure was more likely than not to win the nomination and would be a serious challenger. But I did not view that as a positive element. I thought he would be an enormously destructive figure. I will say that as a general matter, the idea that a businessman or woman would make a great political figure because they could make government work like a business was always pretty ridiculous. Government does not operate like business, and you need to know how politics and governance work. But there was a bigger problem with Trump that I think we've seen play out, which makes me believe that he was a disaster for the country.
And here we are several years later and still seeing headlines like this one. Over 100 Republicans, including former officials, threaten to split from the GOP. In other words, Republicans still trying to figure out how to get Donald Trump, at least some Republicans, trying to figure out how to get him out of the party. But it's really too late for that. Far too late.
Yeah. And, while Trump's public voice has been dramatically muted without the platform that he had on Twitter and on Facebook, he is still the dominant force with Republicans in Congress and with Republicans in the rank and file around the country. And of course, the hold that he has on Republicans in Congress has a lot to do with the fact that 80% of their constituents still think Trump is terrific, and 70% believe that Trump won the election and that it was stolen from him. Now, what I would say, Martin, is that the 100 Republicans who signed this letter, some very, very prominent people, and some who haven't, and some who continue to identify as Republicans, I think fall into two categories. One is the category of strongly conservative people who are just appalled by Trump's personal behavior and divisive style and corruption, and the corruption that he brought within the administration, and the lack of concern with the norms of our political process. So that includes Liz Cheney, obviously, now, but Bill Kristol and Michael Gerson and Steve Schmidt and a number of others.
George Will.
The second category is people who might be socially moderate or liberal, fiscally conservative, who have had trouble for a while, even before Trump came along, before the Republican Party really changed, which was long before Trump. Trump was an accelerant in this process, but who really felt that they had no home, that they were not comfortable with the Republican Party because of its positions on social issues, but also the fact that these fiscal conservatism only worked when there was a Democratic president and not when there was a Republican president. And yet, the Democratic Party was not a place that made them comfortable either. And in another political system, a parliamentary system, they wouldn't have any difficulty finding a home with multiple parties. But, it's a dilemma for them now.
So what do you make of this effort to potentially form a splinter party? I personally don't see it going anywhere.
It's going to be very, very hard for this to achieve any traction. And the fundamental reason to start with is that our political system, the way the system itself is structured in the Constitution and the laws that have been built around it, make it exceedingly difficult for a third party to take hold in anything more than a splinter way, or as a minor party, it can have an impact. You could certainly argue, for example, that in 2016, the Green Party and the Libertarian Party drew off enough votes from Hillary Clinton that it made a difference, a big difference. Certainly Jill Stein pulled away enough votes, more votes in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania than was Trump's margin of victory.
Ralph Nader in 2000.
And Ralph Nader in 2000, even more so. But that's very different from having a party that wins significant seats in Congress or in state legislatures, that wins statewide offices like governor or attorney general, that holds enough seats in Congress that you can actually be a power broker. And, until there is a reckoning in the Republican Party, one that may convince a far larger number than we've seen up to now, that it's just not worth it to have the label anymore, which is not likely to happen. This effort, which, people who don't like Trump and who think that the Republican Party has gone rogue would see as commendable, you still have to look at it with a great deal of skepticism.
And Ross Perot in 92, he won 19% of the popular vote, but he was more a personality than a party. I mean, there was really no party apparatus underneath him.
Perhaps the best example is George Wallace and the American Independent Party. George Wallace made a huge difference in 1968. He won almost 13% of the votes. He would likely have done significantly better if he hadn't been shot and paralyzed the next time around. But he was determined to have that party, which started as a personality-driven party, establish itself. And of course, once he left, it was gone. We did have an American independent candidate for the presidency 4 years later. His name was John Schmitz. He was actually a John Bircher type, quite a radical man. For those old enough to remember Schlitz beer, he had a slogan for his presidential campaign: when you're out of Schmitz, you're out of gear. The beer slogan was, when you're out of Schlitz, you're out of beer. And that was the only meaningful thing that emerged from that campaign, other than the fact that we learned that Mary Kay Letourneau was his daughter.
My grandfather used to drink that beer. I had no idea the connection.
So, that's an item of ridiculous trivia, but it tells you. And of course, we had John Anderson get 9% of the votes in 1980 and try to establish a party. When these third parties emerge in presidential campaigns, they are almost always driven by a dominant personality. You could take it back to Robert La Follette in the 1920s and 1930s. And once the dominant personalities go, our system just doesn't allow it to work. And of course, the fact is that they were forces in presidential elections, but never elected anybody to another office.
Bull Moose in 1912 with Teddy Roosevelt.
Yes.
Last time that the second place finisher was not one of the two major parties.
And of course, Perot, it was interesting. If you go back a few months before the election, the summer of 1992, Perot was actually leading in the polls. He had a higher percentage of plurality support, greater than the Democratic nominee, Bill Clinton, or the Republican nominee, George Herbert Walker Bush. Then he did some things that had people wondering if he had the capacity to be president, and he dropped, but still got 19%. But that was, again, driven by a strong personality, not was a populist move, but there were also populist moves that year on the left with Ralph Nader and on the right with Pat Buchanan. And you could even argue that Pat Buchanan may have had a larger impact by drawing votes away from the nominee than did Ross Perot.
I thought Donald Trump identified the Perot constituency, anti-free trade, populist, and in a sense, Donald Trump ran as a third party of sorts, as an insurgent from within one of the two major parties, because he was certainly critical of Republicans during the GOP primaries.
I think there was an appeal there that was this deep populist appeal. The populism can come on the left, as it did with Nader, and in the center with Perot, on the right back in 92 with Buchanan. The right-wing populism is more of a nativist, protectionist, and isolationist kind of appeal. And certainly Trump hit all of those notes. But, keep in mind that the kind of populism that we're talking about in this case started in 2008 with the financial collapse and the Tea Party movement. And it continued in a way that even when the economy started to get better, brought other uglier forces out, including racism through the Obama years, and a great deal of frustration, I think, from many Republicans that the promises that they'd been made, if you think about it, when the young guns, as they labeled themselves, Paul Ryan, Kevin McCarthy, Eric Cantor, campaigned in 2010, they promised the Tea Party movement and all of those angry Republicans that it was going to be different, that they would bring Barack Obama to his knees with their majority. They would use the debt ceiling to blow things up. They would dramatically slash spending and cut taxes, and they would usher in a Republican victory in the presidency in 2012. And they failed. And they promised again in an even more elaborate way in 2014 in the midterms, and they won the Senate, and they were presumably in great shape, but they didn't succeed in reversing the policies that were out there. And so I think the mood of the party had shifted, and they wanted somebody who was going to bludgeon not just Democrats, but the establishment. And remember that Trump didn't just take on Jeb Bush. He took on Fox News with Megyn Kelly. He took on all the other candidates. He basically said, I'm not going to take crap from anybody. And the kinds of appeals that he made, I think, were resonant with a group of people where the establishment of the Republican Party, and that includes, of course, figures like Lindsey Graham, who said Donald Trump is a narcissistic sociopath. If we give him the nomination, the Republican Party will be devastated and destroyed as a consequence, and we'll deserve it. And look where Lindsey Graham is now. This has become a cult of personality in a way that I don't think we've seen in our party system ever, certainly not in our lifetimes. And that's, as much as anything, what's motivating a lot of these people who are looking to form a third party.
A Gallup poll found Americans' desire for a third party has ticked up since last fall. Now sits at a high in Gallup's records. 62% of U.S. adults say the parties, meaning Democrats and Republicans, do such a poor job representing the American people that a third party is needed. So, number one, do you agree with that poll's findings? And number two, to what extent does the following contribute to that 62%? That the two major parties are now monolithic. At least that's what our next guest on this podcast argues, Lee Drutman from New America. He says we used to have a four-party system where you had conservative and liberal wings in each party.
I actually did a debate with Lee Drutman, who I think very, very highly of, where I was on the other side. It was about what happens to the two-party system. And I'm certainly not a fan of at all of where we've become. But for all the reasons that we've just talked about, barring dramatic institutional reform, that's simply not going to change. Now, that Gallup poll, most people who are experts in public opinion, most political scientists, wouldn't pay a lot of attention to it or put a lot of credence into it. And think about it in the broader way. we get all of these surveys that show that the biggest group in the country is independents, and that more Americans are independents than are Democrats or Republicans. And that's where the growth is coming. And so that's going to usher in a very different reality. But what we've known for decades is if you take those independents and parse them out, if you ask people whether they lean to one party or the other, most of those who say they're independents do lean. And you're left with roughly 10% who are purely independent. And the ones who lean, who say they're independent but lean to the Republican Party or independent lean to the Democratic Party, in their behavior in the electorate, they vote the same as those who flat out say, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican. So that's why we just don't see this play out in congressional elections, why we don't see that many independent candidates and why they don't win for the most part. The only ones who do, rare cases, are like Bernie Sanders, but they become party members when they're there and everything except the line when they're up for re-election. So it's hard to take those numbers seriously as being the advent of a move towards a genuine third party.
I'm not sure of the way out of this. I don't want to live in a country where I know automatically where each state is going to land every 4 years, or based on where you live, I can guess your politics. I mean, one way out of it is for people who live in liberal cities to move to the heartland, to borrow that cliche, or to do away with some of the anti-democratic elements within our system, such as the Electoral College. These are fantasies I'm talking here. That's
Sure.
not going to happen.
Yeah, the problem we have now is that even in areas where we used to have broad bipartisan agreement for reform, almost everything now falls down on tribal lines. But certainly, if we had some of the reforms that Lee Drutman will talk to you about, including ranked choice voting, multi-member districts, and giving us some opportunities for a rough form of proportional representation, it would be a different world. We could have more heterogeneous districts. We could have more candidates who would tend to be more moderate. But to be frank with you, that's not the greatest of my concerns right now. The greatest of my concerns is whether we're going to continue to have a democracy at all when we have laws being passed in states that are designed to overturn election outcomes if they don't meet the test of a party that's drafting these laws.
Norm Ornstein, Emeritus Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. We thank you for sharing your concerns with the state of our democracy today. Now let's go right to our next conversation with Lee Drutman, Senior Fellow at New America, and as mentioned, the author of Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop. And he is also the host of a podcast of his own called Politics in Question. Lee Drutman, welcome.
Good to be talking with you, Martin.
So the first sentence of your book is American democracy is in precarious health. I would tend to agree. There are many reasons for that. The one you zero in on in your book is this hardened, ideologically rigid two-party system that prevents third parties from gaining any traction because of the way we do our elections, right?
That's right. We have a system of single winner elections. And when you have single winner elections, it's very hard for third parties to compete because they're treated as spoilers. All of the energy and mobilization and resources go into the two major parties, and third parties wind up as places for dissenters and cranks and other sundry characters.
And you tend to focus not so much on individuals, but on structural causes, right?
That's right. I mean, individuals are important, but individuals are constrained by the systems in which they operate. And there are broad political incentives in our system that shape how politicians behave. And so when you think about the rising polarization in our party system, it's really a response to the ways in which our parties have organized and the way in which elections work. And that is important because it directs our focus to the rules of the game themselves, rather than saying we need politicians to compromise more or be more moderate. We have to understand the reasons why they don't behave in the ways that a lot of folks think that they should.
Yeah, I can't think of any other Republican politician or really anyone who could have done what Donald Trump did in 2016. He was able to run as an anti-politician and an outsider because he truly was one. He was a reality TV host, and he ran an insurgency from within the Republican Party. In a sense, his third party within a party. Get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I get what you're saying.
So I think in that case, an individual did have an outsized role on, well, at least what we're seeing right now.
Sure. I mean, Trump is obviously an incredibly important figure, but I think the way I would look at it is that Trump was identifying and responding to a desire within the Republican electorate for somebody like him who was, both an politician, and also, really tapped into strong anti-immigration views among that had been growing among many voters, and the way in which the Republican Party fell in line behind Trump also reflects, I think, more importantly, the structural nature of the two-party system, that there was no alternative for a lot of Republican elected officials who initially did not want Trump, saw him as a dangerous threat, but have since embraced him and his style of politics because there's no other opportunity for these folks to maintain their role as elected politicians other than to join with Trump once he became the kind of de facto leader of the party.
That's a good point. It is a Trump party now. So what do you think of this headline from a couple of weeks ago? Over 100 Republicans, including former officials, threatened to split from the GOP. Apparently a top-down approach towards potentially forming a third party if the Republican Party does not make changes that these 100 individuals want. Does this have any chance of going anywhere?
It could, if the folks who are organizing this effort are serious about running candidates, particularly in swing districts where a candidate that they support could get 10% of the vote, perhaps, and keep Republicans from winning office. That would be the most effective way for them to have an impact. I don't know if they're going to be able to recruit and support such candidates, but if they wanted to have an impact, that's how they could do it. And that's broadly the history of third parties in the U.S. is that they don't have an effect so much by winning elections themselves, but they have an effect by keeping other parties out of power and forcing them to respond.
A new Gallup poll found 62% of U.S. adults say the parties do such a poor job representing the American people that a third party is needed. So it seems there is fertile ground for your thesis here, that it's time to blow up this two-party system, at least as it's come to exist.
Yeah, well, the American people have been saying this to pollsters for quite a while now. Really, since Perot, there's been significant support for a third party. Half of Americans now identify themselves as independent rather than as a Democrat or a Republican. So there's certainly a demand for more options. However, the challenge is that there's no agreement on what those options, what that third party should look like. And I've done polling to this effect, and some people want a third party that's more liberal than the Democratic Party. Some people want a third party that's kind of in the middle, and some people want a third party that's even more conservative than they perceive the Republican Party to be. So in order for a third party to emerge in our winner-take-all system, you'd basically have to see the collapse of one of the two major parties, which is how the Republican Party emerged in the 1850s after the Whigs split over slavery. Or, as I propose in Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop, we change the electoral rules and get rid of our winner-take-all system and replace it with the system that most advanced democracies around the world use, which is a proportional representation. In particular, I recommend the Irish version of proportional representation, which is multi-member districts of 3 to 5 members with ranked choice voting. And I think it would be a system that would much better reflect the diversity of the American people, give people more choices, and break this dangerous binary competition for power that is really destroying the core of American democracy right now, which is the legitimacy of free and fair elections.
So when it comes to parliamentary systems, you said the Irish system is a model, but those systems also can create chaos as well. If you look at, say, Israel's parliamentary system and the inability to form a government there.
Yeah, I want to make an important distinction because I think we often equate parliamentary with multi-party systems. And you can have a parliamentary system that's a two-party system, like the UK. You can have a multi-party system that's a presidential system. So there's a proportional representation versus single winner is how you do elections. A parliamentary system versus presidential is whether you have in a parliamentary system, you have a prime minister who's the leader of the party in the legislature. In a presidential system, you have a separately elected president. It's true that most multi-party systems are parliamentary systems in Western Europe, which is often the comparison that we make. However, there are other countries around the world that have presidential systems with proportional representation. As to your point about multi-party systems, sometimes having chaos to form governments, this is true. It does take time for governments to sometimes form. Now, Israel is an example that's often touted as an example of a kind of dysfunctional proportional representation system, although Israel is kind of a singular country and has many of its own challenges. I think if you look at multi-party democracies around the world, Ireland, New Zealand, Germany, Sweden, Denmark, there are a lot of very functional multi-party systems with proportional representation. We should look at multi-party systems on the whole and not just look for
the messiest possible example I could find, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you for clarifying that. So let's get really to the heart of the matter here. You're not simply advocating for a third party to contend with the Republicans and Democrats. You want a more open multi-party system where there are fundamental changes as to how we elect people.
That's right. I think we would be much better served as a nation with having a form of proportional representation where every vote matters equally, because you don't have to live in a swing district for your vote to be consequential, where voters have more choices, and where politics is not so binary. There's something really fundamental about the binary nature of our politics that trips on these deep mental circuits that we have to see the world in this black and white, us against them way. And that's a really destructive way of thinking about politics, because it turns us against our fellow citizens. And one of the things that is significant about the multi-party systems is that they just don't have that level of hatred of opposing partisans. One, because things are not so binary. Two, because voters are more likely to kind of shift between different parties because there's more choices. Parties are more likely to be in coalition with each other. And voters themselves are not, as segregated into red and blue parts of the country. I mean, what we have, right now in America is just a level of partisan segregation that puts so many Americans into these echo chambers where they don't ever hear a dissenting perspective or an alternate perspective and become so right and righteous in their understanding of how things work that they can't even hear an alternative.
These categories feed on themselves. They reinforce. It's like a feedback loop of reinforcement.
A doom loop.
That's
what you might even call it.
Yeah, a doom loop. I grew up in the Northeast, New York and New Jersey, and it was common to have liberal Republicans, conservative Democrats. That's one of the salient points in your book that we used to have a hidden four-party system, is how you describe it. Can you elaborate?
In an earlier era in which American politics was not nearly as nationalized or polarized, there were plenty of liberal Republicans, classic Nelson Rock from New York, Nelson Rockefeller, or Jacob Javits. And, they were, Republican on many issues, but there were a lot of issues where they worked with Democrats. Similarly, you used to have a lot of conservative Democrats, largely from the South and some rural parts of the country, who, were socially conservative and worked with Republicans on a lot of issues. And so effectively you had something like a four-party system. And for a period of time, I think that worked pretty well because the coalitions were fluid and, it didn't matter so much which party controlled Congress, because you would wind up with a lot of bipartisanship either way. And what voters cared more about was the individual representative and their values, as opposed to the D or the R next to them. And as politics nationalized, as politics became more about culture war, as parties sorted and segregated, and as elections became constantly up for grabs, and money and campaign messaging became the central moving force in politics, we lost those distinctions. Parties became much better sorted, and it became a lot harder to be a liberal Republican. And voters cared more about Democrat or Republican than the individual candidates themselves. And this, reinforced itself. It's a feedback loop, a doom loop. And here we are in this moment of really existential challenge for our democracy.
Because right now someone would say, well, why bother voting for a third party? It's a waste. But in a proportional system, you wouldn't have to come out on top, right? Because
That's right.
a Green Party might win 7 or 8 seats in the next Congress, and then
That's right. Yeah.
a fourth party would win 12 or 20 seats, and
Right. That's exactly right.
Yeah. So, what does the Bull Moose election of 1912 teach us about what we're going through here today? Because that was the last time that the second place finisher wasn't one of the major parties. So that was obviously Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, won. But Teddy Roosevelt came in second. It was the Republicans who finished third there. I mean, I guess that's another spoiler example, right?
Yeah, it is a spoiler example. I mean, to be honest, I'm not sure how much that election teaches us about today. I mean, I think it was largely about Teddy Roosevelt splitting with the Republican Party and deciding that he wanted to run as a third party candidate, and he really split the Republican vote. It was an interesting election in that it did reflect a split in the Republican Party, and that's how you might get a new party, is if one of the two parties splits. But for whatever reason, the Republican Party reunited into one whole, and the split never happened. I mean, you could have seen at that time, you could have imagined a new progressive party kind of emerging and realigning American politics, but that didn't happen, possibly because Roosevelt, TR, died before 1916.
And he was a larger-than-life figure, too, which helped him mount that challenge.
Certainly did.
In 1948, there were 4 major candidates on the ballot. But again, these were more of one-off type situations.
Yeah, exactly. And they're also at the presidential level. And I think if we're going to see new parties emerge, they'll emerge at the congressional level first.
So let's wrap up with this. Returning to the initial premise here about democracy is in precarious health. There are a lot of reasons for this, but just how important is this hardened two-party system when it comes to measuring the health of our democracy? Because it's facing a lot of challenges, not just the way we do our elections.
Yeah, that's right. So, in order for democracy to work, you need a few basic premises. One is that parties have to be able to lose elections. They have to acknowledge that they can lose, and rather than declaring that the election was stolen and the rules were rigged, they have to say, well, look, we'll run a different campaign and we'll try something different next time.
Mutual forbearance, I suppose, is the way.
Yes, in the Levitsky and Ziblatt How Democracies Die framework. Well, that's an acceptance of legitimate opposition. And then the second point is this forbearance point, which is that parties that are in power don't change the rules in a way that restricts the vote of their competitors. And what we're seeing now is that the Republican Party is breaking both of those rules in 2021 by inventing a phony theory that they've been unable to generate any evidence that would hold up in court. And that challenges the fundamental legitimacy of elections. And on top of that, in the states where Republicans have power, they've been passing laws that are targeted at making it harder for Democrats to win elections. And it's pretty transparent what they're doing. And that is violating the forbearance, which is that you don't restrict the voting rights and civil liberties of your political opposition. And without that commitment to democracy from one of the two major parties, it's very hard to have a democracy.
Lee Drutman and Norm Ornstein, we are indebted for both of your insights into our political dilemmas. On the next episode of History as It Happens, we'll examine the difference between history and memory, and our subject will be D-Day.
No direct radio contact, but destroyers report first and second waves appear to be pinned down on the beach. Concentrated artillery and mortar fire. Third wave floundering. Heavy casualties, sir.
The liberation of Europe required, in the words of the historian who will join us, unprecedented destruction. Why that matters, then and now. That's next when we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.